A decorated veteran in a wheelchair rolled toward the tomb guard. Nobody paid attention at first. Just another visitor at Arlington, they thought. But then he stopped at the rope line and began to rise. At first, no one understood. Cameras froze midair. Parents hushed their kids. Even the tomb guard didn't move, his rifle tight against his shoulder, his face carved from stone. What happened next broke every rule, every protocol, and silenced an entire plaza. And if you think this was just another ceremony, you're wrong, because the man struggling to stand carried a secret, a promise made half a century ago on a battlefield far from home. And before this day was over, that promise would change everything. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. It was a quiet morning at Arlington National Cemetery, the kind where the air feels heavier than usual, as if it carries the weight of all the sacrifices made on those grounds. The American flag waves softly in the breeze above the tomb of the unknown soldier. Hundreds of tourists gathered along the marble plaza, cameras ready, whispers carried through the air, but no one dared cross the black rope line. Staff Sergeant Evan Blackwood stood at his post, motionless, dressed in the navy blue ceremonial uniform of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard. His white gloves gripped the polished M14 rifle resting perfectly against his shoulder. His kepi hat sat squarely on his head, sunglasses hiding his focused gaze. To anyone watching, he looked like a statue carved from stone, unmoving, unshakable, eternal. But inside, Evan's thoughts were as disciplined as his posture. Every muscle, every breath, every glance was measured to perfection. He had sworn an oath to guard the sacred ground with absolute silence and precision. Here, there were no distractions, no opinions, no excuses. Only duty. The crowd shuffled slightly as a new figure approached from the main pathway. A man in his mid-60s, moving slowly in a wheelchair, rolled closer toward the rope line. His hands pushed the wheels with quiet strength, practiced and steady even though his legs, covered neatly with a folded wool blanket, showed no signs of life. Captain Michael Reynolds, Vietnam veteran, Medal of Honor recipient. His gray hair caught the sunlight and his chest was adorned with decorations most people had only ever seen in museums. But one medal stood out, a simple gold star hanging from a blue ribbon, the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award for valor. Beside him walked his daughter, Grace, keeping a hand gently on his shoulder, watching him closely. She had begged him not to exert himself today, but Mike had insisted, because this wasn't just another visit. He had come here to honor a promise, one he had carried for more than 40 years. The tourists began to notice him now, whispers rippling through the crowd. A few veterans among them straightened their backs, recognizing instantly what that blue ribbon meant. And though Evan Blackwood didn't move a muscle, his sharp eyes caught it too. Something about this veteran's presence dealt different. Something was about to happen. Captain Michael Reynolds rolled forward slowly, the steady rhythm of his wheels echoing softly against the marble plaza. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the sacred ground of Arlington. His daughter, Grace, walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She glanced at her father's face, the determined jaw, the tightened grip on the wheelchair's rims, and knew better than to stop him. "Dad," she whispered, "are you sure you want to do this today?" Mike didn't look at her. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had seen more than most could imagine. "I didn't come here to watch, Grace," he said softly. "I came here to stand." Grace stopped, letting his words settle in the cool autumn air. Up ahead, Staff Sergeant Evan Blackwood stood motionless at the tomb. He had seen thousands of visitors, from school groups to foreign dignitaries, but something about this moment felt different. Through his peripheral vision, trained from years of discipline, he caught the faint glint of gold on Mike's chest, the Medal of Honor. Evan's jaw clenched slightly beneath his sunglasses, though his body didn't betray the thought. He had studied it in training, memorized its history, understood its weight. Fewer than 70 living Americans wore that ribbon. To be in the presence of one wasn't just rare, it was sacred. And yet, protocol demanded he remain silent. Mike rolled closer to the rope line until he was only a few feet away. The crowd began to quiet, sensing something unusual unfolding before them. Parents lifted their children so they could see. Veterans in baseball caps embroidered with unit patches removed them instinctively, holding them over their hearts. Mike stopped his wheelchair, resting his hands on the cold metal rims. He looked up at the tomb, its white marble glowing in the late morning sun. For a long moment, he said nothing. In his mind, he was back there, 1971, deep in the jungles of Vietnam. The smoke, the screams, the explosion that had taken his legs, the faces of men who had never come home. "Tommy," he whispered under his breath, almost too soft to hear. "I made you a promise." Grace heard him and lowered her head, squeezing his shoulder gently, but she said nothing. Evan remained at his post, rifle against his shoulder, gaze locked straight ahead. His training told him to ignore the veteran, to stay unmoving, detached, but his instincts as a soldier and as a man told him otherwise. Inside, he thought, "He's Medal of Honor, Vietnam. He's earned more than my silence." Mike straightened in his chair, drawing a deep, shaky breath. He took one last look at the tomb and then glanced toward Evan, studying the young guard's posture, the immaculate uniform, the unbroken stillness. "You wear it well, son," Mike said quietly, his voice gravelly but warm. "You guard them well." Evan didn't respond, couldn't respond. Regulations forbade it. But his chest tightened beneath his uniform, and behind his sunglasses, his eyes flickered ever so slightly, acknowledgments without a word. The silence around them deepened, as though the entire plaza had stopped breathing. Mike placed his hands firmly on the arms of his wheelchair, his knuckles whitening from the effort. Grace stepped closer, alarmed. "Dad." He looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time," he said. The crowd didn't know what he meant yet, but Evan understood. Something irreversible was about to begin. The air over Arlington grew impossibly still. Even the rustle of leaves seemed to quiet, as Captain Michael Reynolds tightened his grip on the arms of his wheelchair. His breaths came slow and controlled, his chest rising and falling beneath the neatly pressed jacket. Grace bent closer, her voice trembling. "Dad, what are you doing?" Mike's eyes never left the tomb. His voice was steady, as if spoken to no one but himself. "I have to stand," he said softly. "One last time." Grace's hand squeezed his shoulder. "Dad, no, you can't." But Mike's jaw was set. She had seen that look before, in old photographs of him at 22, standing next to his platoon, dirt smeared on his face, pride burning in his eyes. And then, slowly, painfully, deliberately, he began to push. His arms trembled immediately, muscles straining beneath the weight of 15 years without the use of his legs. His palms pressed down against the wheelchair's arms, his upper body rising inch by inch. The chair creaked softly under the shifting load. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones that had been raised to take pictures lowered instinctively. Hats came off. The plaza fell silent. Evan Blackwood's breath caught in his throat. From behind his sunglasses, he watched the impossible unfolding through the sharp edge of his peripheral vision. He was trained to not move, not to react, but every fiber of his being screamed to do something, to say something. "Stay still. Protocol. You are the guard. You are the ceremony. But another voice inside him, quieter, older, deeper, whispered something else. That man's a warrior. Respect him. Mike's body shook as he pushed himself higher, his arms trembling violently now. Sweat rolled down the side of his temple, catching the sunlight. His Medal of Honor glinted like a shard of fire on his chest, every reflection a reminder of what it had cost him to earn it. He locked his elbows, chest heaving, and straightened his spine as far as it could go. He was upright now, unsteady but towering in his dignity. Then, with slow, deliberate precision, he raised his right hand. The salute was perfect. Grace covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The crowd behind her seemed to dissolve into silence so absolute that the only sound was a soft snap of fabric as the American...
For them, he whispered, voice raw but unbroken. Evan's throat tightened. He gave the smallest of nods beneath his sunglasses, just enough for Mike to know he'd heard. Around them, veterans who had been watching stood to attention instinctively. A retired Marine raised his own salute, his hands shaking. A former Army nurse clasped her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. Parents lifted their children so they could see, murmuring softly about what was happening. And still, neither Evan nor Mike moved. The salute held. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Mike's arms began to shake uncontrollably now. Every muscle in his upper body burned with pain, but his salute never wavered. Grace took a step forward, panicked. "Dad, please, you have to sit." But Mike didn't hear her. His eyes were fixed on the tomb, on the silent guard before him, on every name that had never been spoken, every soldier who had never come home. Finally, his strength began to fail. His knees buckled, his balance wavered, his breath hissed sharply in his chest, and before anyone could react, Evan broke protocol a second time. 2 sharp, precise steps brought him forward, his boots striking the stone with authority. With one smooth motion, he slid his left arm under Mike's and steadied him, lowering him gently back into his wheelchair. Mike's head fell back, his breath shallow, but even. His hand dropped to his lap, fingers trembling from exhaustion. Evan knelt slightly, leaning close, his voice low enough only Mike could hear. "You stood for them," Evan said softly. "Let me stand for you." Mike's lips curled into the faintest smile. His voice came out rough but strong. "Thank you, son." Grace wiped her face, her hands trembling. Around them, the plaza remained silent, the weight of what had just unfolded sinking deep into the hearts of everyone present. No one raised a phone, no one whispered, because they knew they had witnessed something far greater than ceremony. They had seen sacrifice made flesh. Captain Michael Reynolds sat back in his wheelchair, his chest rising and falling, each breath heavy but steady. Beads of sweat clung to his forehead, yet there was pride in his eyes. Quiet, unshakable pride. Grace knelt beside him, brushing the damp strands of gray hair from his temple. "You shouldn't have done that, Dad," she whispered, voice breaking. Mike turned his head slowly toward her, his voice low and ragged but resolute. "I had to, Grace. I owed them that much." She swallowed hard, knowing exactly who he meant. The men who never came home. The brothers whose names were carved into marble or buried beneath unmarked earth halfway around the world. Evan Blackwood straightened, returning his rifle to position, but he didn't immediately step back to his post. He stood just behind Mike, his white-gloved hand still resting lightly on the veteran's shoulder, his posture caught between duty and humanity. From the corner of his eye, Evan noticed Major Thomas Hale approaching. The old guard commander's presence carried weight in every step, precise, deliberate, radiating authority. Hale was a man of absolute rules, and Evan knew he had just violated the 2 most sacred: never break silence, never break position. Evan braced for reprimand, shoulders tightening beneath his pristine uniform. But Hale didn't speak. He stopped a few feet away, his sharp gaze sweeping over Mike's chest, pausing on the Medal of Honor. The major's jaw shifted slightly, and for a moment his voice softened. "At ease, Sergeant," Hale said quietly. "You did right." Evan blinked beneath his sunglasses, relief washing through him, though he didn't dare show it. He nodded once, crisp and silent. Mike, hearing Hale's voice, lifted his chin slightly, regarding the officer with quiet dignity. "Major," Mike said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Captain Reynolds," Hale replied, his tone low and respectful. "It's an honor to have you here." Mike offered the faintest smile. "No, Major, the honor is theirs," he said, nodding toward the tomb. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was sacred. Then another voice came from behind the crowd, low and steady. "I know who you are." An older man in a faded Marine Corps ball cap stepped forward, his gait slow but purposeful. His jacket bore the patches of a Vietnam unit, sun-faded but carefully preserved. Wallace squinted before recognition sparked in his tired eyes. "Wallace!" Mike breathed. "Lieutenant Wallace! I thought you didn't make it out." The Marine's lips trembled before settling into a quiet smile. "Somehow I did," Wallace said, his voice rough with age and memory. "Because of you." Grace watched as Wallace stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Mike's shoulder. "You remember that village," Wallace said softly. "The ambush? You went back 3 times. 3 trips, Mike, through machine gun fire, dragged out civilians first, then Marines, then me. That mine went off on the 4th run." Mike's hand moved instinctively to the Medal of Honor resting against his chest. "I just did what any of us would have done," he murmured, voice tight. Wallace shook his head, his throat thick with emotion. "No," he said firmly. "You did what none of us could, and today you just did it again." Grace bit her lip, tears streaking her cheeks. Around them, more veterans in the crowd began stepping closer, forming an unspoken circle. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, united, generations of soldiers linked by something beyond words. Evan glanced at them briefly, then back at Mike. He felt the weight of the uniform on his shoulders, but also something deeper, the connection to everyone standing here. Mike turned his head slightly toward Evan, his voice quiet but deliberate. "Guard," he said, his tone carrying the weight of decades. "Your post, it matters. Don't ever forget why you stand there." Evan swallowed hard, his voice low but steady. "Yes, sir." He said the words leaving him like an oath renewed. Major Hale finally stepped forward, his voice clear but subdued, meant for Evan and every veteran within earshot. "The uniform changes," Hale said, his gaze steady, "but the duty never does. We stand not for ourselves, but for them." Mike nodded faintly, his eyes glistening. "And sometimes," he whispered, "standing guard means breaking position to honor what truly matters." The veterans tightened their circle, silent witnesses to a moment where rank, time, and protocol fell away. The plaza was hushed, the air heavy with history. For a fleeting instant, it was as if the entire weight of sacrifice, every battle, every name, every folded flag, rested on this small patch of marble. The plaza slowly began to breathe again, but the silence lingered like a sacred echo. Captain Michael Reynolds sat quietly in his wheelchair, his chest rising and falling, his Medal of Honor catching the soft midday light. Grace knelt beside him, brushing away the last beads of sweat from his forehead, while the circle of veterans stood like sentinels around them, heads bowed in silent respect. Evan Blackwood stepped back, rifle against his shoulder once more. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, letting the weight of the moment settle deep into his chest. He had broken protocol twice today, but for the first time in his career, he understood exactly why he stood there, why every guard before him had stood there. Inside, his thoughts carried the quiet weight of revelation. This post isn't just about standing still. It's about standing for them, for every name that isn't known, every family that never got an answer, every promise that someone like Captain Reynolds made and kept. Mike turned slightly, his gaze finding Evan one last time. His voice was low but steady, the tone of a man passing a torch. "You did right, son. Never forget. It's not the uniform that gives this place meaning, it's what you're guarding." Evan swallowed hard and nodded, his jaw tight, his voice calm but reverent. "Yes, sir. I understand now." Major Hale stepped closer, placing a firm hand on Evan's shoulder. His tone was quiet, measured. "Carry on, Sergeant." Evan snapped back to attention with precision, heels striking the marble sharply, rifle perfectly aligned. As he stepped back into his exact position, the silence reclaimed the plaza. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many wiping their eyes, others holding their children's hands a little tighter. A few veterans paused before leaving, placing hands over their hearts in silent salute to both men. Mike wheeled away with Grace beside him, his shadow stretching long behind him in the afternoon sun. For the first time in years, his back was straight, his bearing proud, and as Evan resumed his watch, the weight of his oath felt heavier. But now it was no longer a burden, it was an honor. Sometimes standing guard isn't about standing still, it's about standing for something. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear another story that's just as powerful and captivating, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about duty and justice. Click on the video.